Hello and welcome to the McCain Institute's Disinformation series. My name is Mike Brand and I'm a Democracy Fellow with the McCain Institute. This series is being hosted by the Task Force on Defeating Disinformation Attacks on U.S. Democracy, a joint project between the McCain Institute and Arizona State University's Cronkite School. We're hosting conversations on the threats of disinformation and how to best address them. For more information about the task force or other projects the McCain Institute is working on, visit our website at mccaininstitute.org. Today, our guest is Dr. Kristy Roschke. Kristy is a media literacy educator and scholar. She's the managing director of the News Lab, a Cronkite School initiative aimed at advancing media literacy via journalism, education, and technology. Her research interests include misinformation, media literacy education, and media trust. She's also a member of our task force on defeating disinformation. Thanks for joining me today, Kristy.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. So a lot of your research and work focuses on media literacy education. Can you tell us a little bit about what media literacy is and why it's so important?
Sure. So kind of one of the standard or like widely used definitions of media literacy in the US is one's ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media messages. So it really just speaks to all the ways that we interact with media messages of all forms, whether that's popular entertainment media or news media, everything in between. So when we talk about, having a media literate society, what we mean is when we're overwhelmed with all of these various messages coming at us really at all sides, how are we accessing, how are we interpreting, and what are we doing with that information? And the hope is that we are making good, positive decisions to strengthen and support our democracy.
That's great. And so in the context of media literacy training and getting people to be more media literate and savvy of how they're, as you said, accepting the media that they're reading and listening to, how does media literacy affect the spread of mis and disinformation?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, and it's interesting because, I'll start by saying there's not nearly enough media literacy education, intentionally in formal school settings, but also in informal settings. And part of that is because I think we all sort of think we know how to access media because, again, we are sort of steeped in it. So there's this misunderstanding or maybe just an overinflation of our own abilities to gather information to answer questions and make decisions. But we don't collectively, sort of as a society, really stop to consider how much the way we access information has changed. I mean, gosh, even in the last 5 years, much less 10, 20, 25 years. And so, when adults became literate, learning to read and write, people who are over the age of, say 20, maybe, they learned in a very different way than they're applying that now. So all of these additional skills that we've sort of layered on top of that reading and writing. So how to use digital technologies, how to know where to find information, how to ask Google or YouTube or whoever you're going to ask to give you some information. We all sort of learned that on the fly and continue to adapt those skills as technology evolves. And so it's great that we can adapt, like nice to know, but also maybe we're not applying the best strategies and skills to doing these things that we could, right? So in the absence of really learning in a formal way, this is how technology works. This is what happens when you're searching Google. This is what happens when now the latest thing is like what happens when you put a query into ChatGPT. Like this is what's actually happening. These are the results you're getting back. This is how you should react to that. We don't do that. And so to get back to your question, how does this impact the spread of mis and disinformation? Well, when we aren't as discerning as we think we are, or maybe as we should be, it allows all kinds of information to proliferate and to just kind of sit alongside the information we should be having, right? The stuff that's based on evidence and consensus versus the stuff that someone just like decided to tweet.
That's a really good point. And so getting people to just better figure out what they're looking at, how to understand that information, and then how to dissect, I don't want to say bad information, but, bad information versus trusted information per se.
Yeah. I mean, it seems so simple, right? When you say it like that. And this is, to be perfectly honest, one of the challenges with like selling media literacy education as a necessity. And I will go on record as saying that I think it is a critical skill and it is absolutely a necessity. But because, when you describe it, it's sort of like, knowing how to look at the internet. I think most of us feel like we're already pretty good at that. We're looking at the internet many hours a day, right? So it's like, what more could I learn? And so that's one of the challenges, to try to explain to people, well, yes, I mean, looking at something and reading it and maybe even comprehending it is great, but that also doesn't include the context with which it was created, the context with which it was shared, the context, with which you're accepting it. Like, all of the sort of bigger picture around any information is so critical these days, because anyone can put information anywhere.
Sure.
And including, as you said, sort of trusted experts, people who have done the work to, find the evidence and be able to say verifiably, this is what's happening, versus people who aren't doing that. And we also, I guess, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but all of those people are mostly using the same sort of persuasive techniques and sharing that information, which makes it even harder to sort of say, well, I should be paying attention to this and not this over here.
Sure. Yeah. And I think at a base level, just better understanding what a trusted source is versus something that could be either an opinion piece or a propaganda piece or an ad, like very basic level of looking at Google and knowing that the first few results are, advertisements at the top. And that's not necessarily the same thing as seeing a website, a few clicks down.
Right.
So,
well, exactly. And I mean, so to that point, even before getting on the internet or interacting with media, the ways that we teach about trusted sources and, scientific method, and the way theory develops and the way consensus develops, regardless if that's online or in person or where that information resides, the way that we do that is not really something we teach young people, for sure. I mean, if you think about it, like, we do not do a good job of teaching young people how scientists decide that something is it is evidence, right?
right.
We teach students how to go through the process of creating science or of creating research, but we don't really explain, well, once you've done the experiment, how do we know if that can be repeatable or generalizable, or that, we're going to use this for other things? And that's a real missed opportunity, because today, since we are all sort of agents of our own information design, we can come up with incorrect conclusions, even when we've employed good critical thinking skills, good search skills, good digital skills, as it were. We can still decide, oh yeah, I'm going to follow this idea, when this idea has not been proven to be accurate.
Sure.
So it's a tricky situation. So yeah, so even just dialing back before we talk about the internet as this like terrible and crazy and unwieldy place, it's like, how are we even teaching people whose voices we should elevate and amplify,
Right.
and whose voices we should not? And there's also different ways we do that, right? We have some experts we trust because they are very smart and they've done a lot of training and they have a lot of real technical or specific domain knowledge. And then there's other people that we trust because they're great in the community, or there's other people that we trust because we think that they're fun and popular and look good or whatever.
Influencers, right?
Yeah, exactly. And all of those things, none of those things are inherently good or bad. And so again, we come back to context. It's like, well, when do I want to sort of question something, and when do I not? And it might be different, and it's different kind of all the time, right? So I guess, sort of in summary of that long-winded answer, again, when we're teaching people, whether that's in school or that's outside of school or that's kids or adults, I think we need to really take into consideration all that happens around the information, instead of just sort of focusing on like, you should go to this source as the good source, and this is, really like zeroing in on one way to do things because there's not one way to do things anymore.
Sure. No, I think it's a great point. And to your point about, educating, that's like media literacy is critical education. I'm curious because obviously at the Cronkite school, the classes that you teach and your colleagues teach, like the students are getting a lot of this information. And there's some schools across the country that are now, or at least at the state level, are mandating, some level of media literacy education in both middle and high schools, depending on where, which is great. And I think, a number of studies have shown that teens are, getting more involved in social media earlier. And so having media literacy is such an important skill. But what about for people that aren't in the classroom? Like you said, engaging with folks outside. I'm sure, if they attend, a program that you're hosting, and it's purposeful that you can reach other people, but they have to do that. They have to go out of their way to show up at a media literacy training in person, or do something online, or go down a rabbit hole, on YouTube or whatever. So how do we reach people about media literacy that aren't already primed for it?
Yeah. I mean, that is like the $1 billion question. And I don't know that we have one good answer. So I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. I mean, one is we have, to your point, done a number of trainings with community groups like AARP locally here in Arizona, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which is a network of sort of lifelong learning classes that are usually paired with colleges, universities, and community colleges around the country. And so they do a lot of like extension learning for older adults. I've done a lot of those presentations. We developed an online MOOC, as they call them, massive open online course in 2020 called Media Active that still exists today. And we really targeted older adults for that class. And again, using these kind of partners in Osher and AARP and others, we're able to find people to take the class. But to your point, most of the people who come to these sessions or took the class are already primed, not only just for media literacy, but they're lifelong learners in general, right? So it was a little bit of preaching to the choir. And so at first we were disappointed, maybe not disappointed, because it's always great to be in front of a room of active learners. But just like, oh gosh, to your question, how do we reach the people who maybe really need this information? And then it occurred to us, and by us, I mean my colleagues at the News Collab, that we all have a role to play in this. And even though, we had 800 people turn up for this class who were already feeling like media literacy was important, they still learned a lot. We know that based on the feedback that we got. And one of the key things they learned was how to share that with other people. And so we all have family members or friends or people in our sphere who are less likely to take a class on media literacy. And so we know that many people who took this class or have taken this class have then used those tactics and techniques to share with the people who were never going to take the class, right? So it ends up being a bit of a grassroots, spread. I think with any education kind of endeavor, it's just really difficult to scale in the way that, like, I don't know, corporate tech companies want to scale. Like, it's just not really how it works. But if we think about scale on a slower, sort of more meaningful community one-to-one base, we're all kind of pushing this forward like ripples in a pond. That also is important. So I feel like we've done a good job there, and we'll continue to try to reach out to different types of community groups that reach those people who aren't like formally in school. And to your point about the classes we teach at Cronkite, certainly helping friends and family is a big component of what they learn, so that they are sort of aware of, well, this is how I can like talk to my mom without upsetting her or making her feel stupid or telling her she's wrong, but maybe we can come to some sort of conclusion, even if that conclusion is cordially agree to disagree. That's still a better conclusion than like some of the conclusions we're drawing at this moment in time, right?
Sure. Yeah, I love the idea that it's almost a grassroots train the trainer model, even if that's not necessarily the intention, but it works out that way.
For sure.
Because you're right, like reaching these folks who aren't going to show up to a training, that's, one of the challenges.
Yeah. And just kind of quickly to add to that, when we think about people wanting to correct misinformation, most people say they don't want to have any part of that, and for reasons you can guess. It's like, they don't want to make people mad. It sort of depends on the relationship they have with the person. They don't want to do it in a public setting because they don't want to make someone feel stupid or put them off. But also sometimes it's because they don't know, like they're not confident enough in what they have done to be able to explain it to someone else. So that is some of the stuff we really focus on in our classes is helping people recognize they already have good processes, but giving them the language to articulate what those processes are so that they then can have a little bit more confidence to say, hey, Mike, I saw that you shared this story and I just kind of want to talk to you about why maybe how you are thinking about the story is a little misguided.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about how we can reach more people and with little things, right? So Twitter a few years ago started to add the little box like, hey, did you read the article before you shared it? Maybe you want to read it first. And it's like one little extra step of don't just press the retweet button, try to check out what you're actually sharing.
Right.
But I wonder at that level, in thinking there's so much conversation right now on, how social media is affecting younger people. And there's proposals in Congress, proposals at the state level of banning children under a certain age from accessing social media or, being a part of it. They could probably access the website, but can't post their own things. But I wonder if that's a strategy of, encouraging these social media companies that if you're under a certain age and you want to sign up for an account, before you do that, you have to read our terms of service, you have to do all the stuff. Maybe there's like a thing that they have to do on media literacy training.
I think that is certainly not a bad idea. And I think there should be more friction involved in signing up for anything for people of all ages. But to your point, especially for young people, because we do go into this so blindly. And again, I think, as I said before, we think we know we have got it all under control and we've got it handled because we just are on our phones all the time. It's just like an inevitability, but we're not really sure how we got there. And so increasing friction, whether it is like those little prompts that you get on social media, or it is like, we're going to give you these terms of service and you are required to do this training. I think those are all really important, good steps. It occurs to me in that scenario with young people, they should have to do that with their parent. Because again, now we're assuming that the parent understands the terms of service, which of course they don't, almost invariably. So, this should be a sort of a family process. So yeah, I think tech companies or social media platform companies have to do things like that to make our use of those tools so much more intentional. There's a lot of other things they could and should be doing as well. But in some ways that still isn't getting at the root of the problem, which is just, we have too many messages. There's just too many messages out there, and there's too many people with ill intent trying to market their messages to us. I mean, ultimately, this is just one big advertising ploy, right? We're either trying to be sold a product, or we're trying to be sold a point of view, or we're trying to be sold some sort of action. So we're just walking around in a world full of advertising and marketing, and whether or not we use social media isn't going to change that. Right. It'll greatly reduce how much we see, I suppose. But like, if we're not addressing that core issue, then we're still way behind.
Right. Yeah. And especially in an age, like you said, where things online are ubiquitous, you can literally within a few seconds find some page, some website, some YouTube video, some kind of clip, meme, whatever, about any issue. Right. And being able to decipher who is the author of this, where is it coming from, what background or education they have in the topic that they're talking about. Is this, based in any reality? Is there facts to back it up? Is there research to back it up, et cetera? It's difficult because, you can make a website that looks just as professional as a leading, journalistic, with full integrity news site. And to the average viewer, they won't know the difference. Or you have a YouTube video or a TikTok video or something where somebody has a background and expertise in something and is making a full video about it, done their research, etc., and somebody who's just making something and spewing out their opinion.
Right.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I mean, it's great that we can share our opinions and our thoughts and our ideas, but the challenge becomes when people look at those two things as this expert who has X number of years of experience versus this random person just making, their opinion heard and thinking that they're the same.
Something I find interesting, and this is less about YouTube maybe, because I think young people for the most part understand sort of how one gets to have a YouTube channel and how one gets to have a popular YouTube channel. But this comes up a lot with my college students with podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to the extent that people watch podcasts on YouTube is a thing too. It always surprises me that just that someone has a podcast provides a level of expertise. So to your point about the website, does the website look official or not? These are real problems, but I feel like they're also kind of 2005 problems.
Mm-hmm.
In 2023, it's more like, one, it's like, well, I listened to this podcast and this podcast is interesting and entertaining. And there's, did I just lose? My screen just blanked out for a second. Sorry.
Nope, you're here.
Might have to cut that. But it's more like, this person has a guest, they're having a conversation about some topic that seems like you need some expertise. So simply by the fact that it exists and it's something I can access via, let's say, Spotify, well, clearly it must have been vetted. Mm-hmm. Well, why clearly? And I think it has this veneer of authenticity because it's on Spotify brand and this person has a podcast with a name and a playlist and all these things. So obviously this person must know what they're talking about. So, and I get it, right? Like that, of course you would think that, but that's obviously absolutely not necessarily the case. And so they're not critical of listening to this podcast in the same way that they might be critical of like, well, I think all news is biased. And so I'm going to like closely critique this news article. So it's a very interesting sort of evolution of how we assign credibility to people. The other thing I want to say is based on, again, like how something looks or where it comes from, with ChatGPT and whatever's going to come next with generative AI, that whole scenario goes away because all you have is an input and an output. And there is no sending you to a website or telling you where this information came from or, giving you rank order list of things to choose from. It's just an answer.
Right.
And
you think because it's giving you that answer, it's the answer.
Correct. And it might be. The thing that's so wild about it is it very well could be. It could be the answer with good sourcing and good, good all the way around good stuff. But it also absolutely could not. And again, for me, it's less about, is it giving you the right answer or the wrong answer, and less about how do we even explain to people what's happening, right? Because again, you just described a series of sort of ways that we discern information, which is like, is this website credible? Is this source credible? Is this quote credible? Is this person credible? But we're moving very quickly into a world where again, all choice is taken away from us in that regard. And we just get spit out an output that who even knows where it came from. Right. And I'm just very concerned about trying to explain to people what even just happened, right? Sure. So that, and I don't even know, I'm trying very quickly to become more of an expert myself so that I can share this with my students. But if we're already behind in the world of social media, we are way behind on what's coming, at sort of breakneck speed. For sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I think on the AI front, they use this broad term. It's not all actually AI, but that's what we're calling everything these days, ChatGPT or otherwise. But it's not just the text inputs and where it's coming from and where it's pulling that information from. There's also obviously, back in the day when Photoshop first came out, right? People didn't know how to deal with Photoshopped images, and a lot of people were getting tricked because we didn't have something before that, right? The closest thing we had was cutting out somebody's head and pasting it onto a magazine of a different person's body. This didn't exist. And I think you're right. I think it's going to take a shift in the knowledge and also the understanding and trying to figure out, what's right, what's not. Like when Wikipedia first came out, right? Lots of people looked at Wikipedia as like for the answer, quote unquote, right? That's where they would go to get their information. And we know it's, generated by users. And so there could be things in there that are wrong. They do try to fact check to some degree, but it's also other users doing that. With ChatGPT, we don't know what the, behind the curtain looks like who's pulling that information, who's providing that information, where it's coming from. And we already know, like in some testings of ChatGPT, like basic things like large number multiplication doesn't come out with the right answer sometimes. And so if that's not able to do that, how do we know it's getting the right answer for a more complex, bigger issue that you're trying to get an answer for? But to me, like one of the challenges is not just that, it's also this next, like everybody's talking about deep fakes, but even not just deep fakes of video and, figuring out how to do that. The audio stuff right now is really scary. And to your point of people buying into podcasts and giving podcasts some level of authority or credibility that they don't give to other things, it's pretty easy to fake somebody's voice now. And when you don't have the video to match up with it to try to see, like, does the lips match with what they're saying? Does it actually make sense? Are they in the right location? Like you could try to find other cues. If you just have some audio of somebody and you say, hey, I heard this, they said this, here's a clip of them saying this, here, they were my guest. It's hard to know if it's true or not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that all of this is there's the potential for malign use for sure. And also just makes it harder for people to say that, hey, that's not me, because we kind of live in this world. It's, I think they call it the liar's dividend, which is like, if people lie enough, then you can just blame everyone for lying. Basically, mm-hmm. It's a sort of like, there is, my defense can be, you're lying and I don't have to prove myself. You have to prove, it's just, we kind of blanket believe that everyone is a liar. And so, me saying that's not me on that podcast, it's like, well, says who,
right.
So I don't have to prove myself because I just have to say everyone's a liar, and so then that becomes, how do we even, technically, how do we prove that mm-hmm. it's a fake? Is obviously a huge problem. And one of the projects I'm working on with colleagues at ASU is a project that's sponsored by DARPA called Semaphore. And that is the whole project, which involves many universities and other entities, is to build systems to detect synthetic media. So to detect deep fakes, as it were. So the detection is going to remain a really, really important piece of this. And you'll have to get more sophisticated in your detection, to your point, when the cues, like the aesthetic cues, or even the computational cues are more difficult to discern. But then there's also that piece of, which is a little bit more existential, which is sort of like, how do we as people decide to trust anything, Right. And yes, we want people to be skeptical. Like we really need people to be skeptical and discerning, but also many people just say, I can't trust anything. I believe nothing. Or I will believe it when I see it. And depending on how they do what they do, they know what they know, they believe what they believe, what conclusions they come to can be vastly different from another person's. Right. So I don't personally believe in objective truth for most things. I think there are some things we can say verifiably the earth is round.
I was literally just thinking the same thing. I wasn't going to put you on the spot. I was going to say, can we agree on this at least? Yeah.
I believe we can agree on that. There are some other big ideas we can agree on, gravity and, those kinds of things. But for many things, there is a sliding scale, right? And so I'm comfortable with that. And I'm comfortable with people viewing things differently than me for some things. So how do we come to back to this consensus world, right? I think I'm getting a little off topic here for a second, but I do think in this quest to understand the impact of mis and disinformation in our society, some of the tactics or the rhetoric that we, meaning sort of the people on the side of truth, and my air quotes are intentional, have done too much of like, I have good facts, you have bad facts. Help me, I'm going to help you find the facts. Where, you know, which just puts the other person in like a place of being defensive and being condescended to and being just feeling dismissed, especially when things are not always so cut and dry. So I really try not to, I don't entertain lies and I don't entertain conspiracy, but I also feel like empathy and understanding to try to find out how someone came to a certain set of truths for themselves in the first place is a maybe a better path forward.
Yeah. And I think your point about like being a healthy skeptic and the idea that everybody's lying, you know, it's kind of this idea of, you know, how fake news came about, right? That if some news is fake, then all news is fake. So now you can't trust any of it, et cetera. But I think it is interesting, you know, we were talking about how do you discern who to trust and who not to trust or what sources or whatever. And the mental exercise that individuals go through to decide that on their own, not, as you were saying, like, you know, there isn't necessarily an objective truth for so many things, but there's some general sources that the majority of the public could look to and say, I trust these sources to some degree. And some people will say no, but like, again, majority. But on an individual basis, people choose, like you said, a podcast or a certain influencer or whatever they're listening to, that they choose to listen to their advice or their opinions about something or what they're telling them. And I think one of the greatest challenges, we've talked about this before, is once something's out there, it's hard to then walk it back. And even if, you know, a news agency, you know, an actual like professional news organization does like, you know, walk something back, they issue a correction or retraction or whatever it is, most people have already seen the first thing. They may not have seen the retraction or the update or the change. And it's even worse for institutions and individuals who don't care to issue those changes or retractions, right? And so how do we deal with that when a video or a post or whatever can go viral with the wrong information, whether that's mis or disinformation, whether that was intentional or not, and then the fact that comes out later, somebody does a fact check, somebody posts it, whether it's Snopes or somebody else, whatever it is, how many people are seeing that?
Right. Yeah, yes, to all of that. That's a lot to unpack. And I'll start with the sort of the institutional dislike of correcting the record. And you can totally understand why that is, why entities, whether that's the media or government or, you know, whatever, don't want to admit when they've got something wrong, because it's a potential blow to credibility, a blow to ego. You know, there's a lot involved in being sort of wanting to always correct the record. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the part of the people who have the megaphone to say, look, you're going to have to get over that. And you're going to have to always correct the record. I'll drop a couple recent research projects that I've worked on. So we did a study with some researchers from Dartmouth where we found that correcting the record, when someone comes across on social media a piece of information that's false, and then they see a correction, they're able to update what they know about that thing. So when we test them later, it's like they've obviously seen the correction, they know the corrected information. So we know that corrections can work. To your point, when you actually see them, right? Which is, I'll get to that point in a minute. But assuming you see a correction, we are cognitively able to say, I understand that the first thing I knew is wrong. This thing, I understand that this is the thing that's accurate. However, the research also found that it dealt a bit of a blow to the trustworthiness, the credibility of the organization after they issued the correction. So what we were hoping to find, obviously, like journalism people, is that like it built trust because that transparency was like, oh, I get that people make mistakes. Thanks for sharing. We didn't really find that. However, this research is limited in that, like, we don't know that that's a long-term blow to the credibility if it's just in that moment. You know, how long that effect lasts. So there's much more research needs to be done. But sort of the conclusion we came to from the journalism perspective is, like, even if you are going to take this potentially temporary hit to your credibility, the number one goal of a journalist is that people have the best available information. And so if corrections work, you got to issue corrections often and always, and in as big a way as possible. And so there are technical ways to make sure people see corrections. Don't hide them on a fact check page, which is not to dismiss fact check pages. Like, that's very important. Attaching the fact checks to social media posts is a much better way to do it, because then it kind of travels along with the information. But it requires also just manpower, people power to say, we are going to always issue corrections, right? You know, and so the more we're doing
the onus is on them to do the right thing, basically.
Yeah, and the more you see that, I hypothesize, I don't know if this is true, but the more there's a culture of correction across all information sources, I think the better people have this feeling that we're hiding. We, as in people who represent big democratic institutions, we are hiding things from the common people. This is a very widely held belief that we are withholding information to control people. If we were a little bit more authentic in transparent in how we share information, and when we get it wrong, I think that just eventually allows people to say, okay, well, they're people just like us, right? They're just not this like monolith of like disseminating information and then never walking anything back. Now, I will say that there's caveats to that too, because like if you think about the speed at which information was changing in the early days of COVID and what that did to really harm the trust of certain institutions, you know, that is something to be learned from. And I guess I would argue, and you know, I'm not an expert in this, but I would argue that some of that was in the delivery, right? There's a haphazard delivery of like, yes, no, you know, these like CDC says this, the WHO says this, and you know, it wasn't coordinated in a way that was like easier to digest. So it's not easy to do, right? Like none of this is easy. I don't mean to say, oh, just correct yourself and everything will be fine. But there's lots of work to do. You know, we have great power institutions hold great power and have traditionally used that power, wielded that power from like a gatekeeper sort of like, I'm going to give you the information that I think you need sort of way. But like those constructs just don't exist in that way anymore. And the more we cling to them, it's like, you know, this is how things are, the more detached people become, you know?
And bringing it back to disinformation, like I think obviously we can expect that certain entities should issue updates to their information based on their value add as a journalist or whatever. But for entities that are purposefully spreading false information, right? Like they don't want to issue an update because they purposely were sharing bad information. On the flip side, people that share misinformation, you know, it wasn't intentional, but they're sharing factually incorrect information. It's interesting because, you know, everything you were just talking about is the issuer issuing a retraction or an update. But when somebody doesn't originate with the information, they're just sharing something that they saw or heard, you then have to convince that person to realize that was wrong information. You should update your postings and your sharings of somebody else's information. And that's where, to your point before, of like throwing facts at somebody sometimes can backfire. But how do we deal with that if you're trying to educate somebody, you know, hey, you're sharing a bunch of false and misleading information. Here's the information that shows you that it's, you know, wrong. If you're not giving them the same original source as the retractor or as the person who's giving them the right information, they could say, well, I don't believe that source.
Right. I mean, all of these things are really good points and are, you know, reasons why this is difficult to do. I think again, we can make the case via education, via like how platforms share information, via how the entity itself describes its processes. One of the markers of credibility should be the desire to correct the record whenever it needs to be corrected. And so eventually, because this isn't something that happens consistently, but eventually it becomes a stronger marker of credibility to say, well, look, all of these people have updated their information, but this one source has not.
Right.
We can say that's because they don't need to, because they were lying in the first place. Like they do not have the same motivation to deal in the factual evidence as other sources. And to your point, yes, maybe on a one-to-one, like this is my trusted source. I don't care that this source says something different. Fine. Like, okay, you can get that. But when it's this source versus a preponderance of evidence from multiple sources,
sure,
that becomes much harder to hold up. Right. And yes, there are people who are just going to die on that hill, as they say, right? They're like, this is the thing. This is my truth. Fine. But for more people, when the consensus and the preponderance of evidence and the multiple sources are saying this over here, then it's like, okay, I get that this is not right, and the truth is most people do that, right? Most people are doing that very well on a regular basis. They're the people that aren't are the people we talk about the most, which maybe that is a problem too, because it overblows,
like sensationalizes it a little bit.
Yeah, it makes us think that more people are like encountering misinformation and disinformation than they actually are. And it's also, just a narrative for the media to say like social media is ruining everything and people are falling for all this stuff. And again, not that that's not true, and not that this is, again, like this is my life's work. So obviously I think it's a very important problem to solve or problem to mitigate. But I also want to just make the point that for most people, they are not coming to wacky conclusions on things, right? And that just isn't, like, there's no story there. There's no conflict for the people who are like, oh, I just heard this fact on a podcast. I wonder if that is accurate. I'm going to go and check other sources. Oh, good. I've just fact checked it. You know what I mean? Like there's no story in that. So
yeah, it's like the boring majority, right? The boring majority is, fact checking to some degree, does maybe do a little due diligence in what they're listening to, does trust more trusted sources, etc. But there is this other group that doesn't. And you're right. I think, we do see it a lot more because it is sexier to talk about to some degree. But I also think, and this is completely not based on any research, but although I'm sure there is research out there, that those numbers are growing to some degree, partially because in today's day and age with technology, people do have, as you said before, these big megaphones that years ago they wouldn't, right? And so you can spread your ideas, your, falsehoods, your lies, your conspiracy theories, whatever you want to call them, in a much wider way than you could have, 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago.
Absolutely. That is correct. I will add the reminder in that even as that makes it such a much more unwieldy problem, and one that's happening just like, all the
rapid
time.
Fire, yeah.
So much of these conspiracy theories, wild ideas, narratives that get into the general, right? And I agree. There are more people now who are on the fringe of these things than there were 10 years ago. It is really not until like mainstream national media and other people, most notably politicians, but other people who of import, right, of prominence. It's not until those people start talking about these things that they go mainstream. So we can sit and talk about all of the ways that, Bob over here starts a thing on 4chan, and it eventually, you know, my dad shares it on Facebook. Like, of course, this is the thing that's important we need to talk about. But that happens much less regularly than Bob putting something on 4chan and an elected official picking it up and running with it, right? Because then when that happens, then the media feel like they have to talk about it, and then everyone knows about it.
Yeah.
So,
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so there's a responsibility that we shirk a lot. That a lot of people shirk in this, and by blaming it on some sort of like technological failure. Don't get me wrong, there are technological failures happening left and right. Like, I'm not saying that they don't, but we also need to hold to account the people who have such important influence that are sharing these things.
Yeah. I think what you just described, I call like the cycle of outrage, where you have something that gets posted somewhere, somebody picks it up, whether that's a politician or some other influencer, shares it out, then the news media, you know, at some level picks it up, or the news media picks it up first and then reports on it, so that then these other people feel like they have to comment on it. And then all of a sudden, you know, these other people who never heard of this before hear of it, like you said, because now it's gone mainstream. And now there's outrage there, but it started from just like one post or one lie or whatever it was, spreads like wildfire. And then even after there is updates and retractions, and, you know, they realize that it was false information, whatever it is, a lot of those people don't see that though. And so it's ingrained in their mind. A, I heard this on the news. B, I heard so-and-so influencer, person of import said it. You know, C, Tommy that I know down the block also thought it and heard about this too. So like, clearly it's not just me. And then that's it. Like, it just keeps spreading.
Yes. And to bring it back to media literacy a little bit, some of that can be mitigated. A tactic, right? Not the tactic, but a tactic, by questioning what's in it for all of these people that are sharing this thing, right? What is in it for the media organization to run this story? What's in it for this politician to pick up this story? What's in it for this government entity to say these things? You know, who stands to benefit, like directly and indirectly, from this message? And again, you know, like, healthy skepticism is a little bit like oversimplification of like the thing, but like recognizing that national media, even though they have an ethical code to report the truth and minimize harm as a profession, they also need to make money off of advertising and viewership and whatever it may be. And also a lot of, like, especially with cable news, when it has to run 24 hours a day, it's a lot of time to fill, and most of it's filled with opinion. So you mentioned this earlier, you know, conflating an opinion piece with, or an analysis with, like, reporting. You know, you see this all the time on those 24-hour channels, because it's a lot cheaper for someone just to, you know, be like me right now and say, here's what I think about this, versus me going out into the field, talking to a bunch of people, doing, you know, research. And so, you know, and being able to add,
even those people and the networks that do have researchers that do the work, that, you know, report, a lot of the time today, at least, they're reporting on other people's reporting too.
Correct.
And so you have, you know, like CNN or MSNBC, Fox, anybody will be reporting on a New York Times piece or a Washington, you know, Journal, something that somebody else did. And so that original reporting is not necessarily right. The subsequent reporting isn't. And that's where it gets a little dangerous, where it's not even necessarily purposeful disinformation or misinformation sharing. It's just, you know, somebody got it wrong, maybe.
Yeah. And so some of that, again, like, not solving the problem, but just even having a better understanding of how all of those systems work and why you're seeing this story now, is helpful. Right? That just helps us navigate things. Even if you're going to continue to watch all the analysis on whatever cable channel you like best, and even if that's going to reinforce some things you already believe, you know, rather people just turn off their TVs, let's be honest. But if you're not going to do that, at least if you can understand
Mm-hmm.
what you're looking at, what purpose it's serving, how it's trying to persuade you, or where it, why it's there in the first place. These are just buffers, right? They're buffers from you getting too sucked into any one idea that it becomes the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, just having that little voice in your head as you're intaking any kind of information to say, hey, did you think about this?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if it's like, I do this all the time, and like we all do this,
Sure.
I will look at something on Instagram and be like, I know this isn't true, but maybe it is. So I'm just going to click it,
Right.
and I will negotiate with myself, but then I'm fairly non-committal about everything, right? It's like,
Right.
okay, well, whether or not that was true, it entertained me for 30 seconds. So fine.
Sure.
It's harmless, right? We want to minimize the harm that any one of these messages is doing for us, for our families, for our communities. And so even if we get it wrong sometimes, right? Even if I'm like, oh, this, I don't know what this celebrity story, this gossip, I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. I'll admit it here on this little conversation. And even before I'm clicking it, when I know like this is just going to be stupid and a waste of my time, I'm still going to do it sometimes.
Right.
But I'm confident enough to say this isn't my truth, right? It's just something, this is just a diversion for 30 seconds.
Yeah. One point, then I'll ask you maybe the final questions, we wrap things up. But I think it's interesting because even the least media literate person does this skepticism stuff on a day-to-day basis, right? Without maybe even knowing it, because all of us, you go to buy something and it's like heavily discounted. And you think to yourself, well, why? Like, is there something wrong with it? Was there, a recall? Is there a reason that all of a sudden this thing's now 50% off? Like, did it not sell? Whatever the question is, right? You have these questions in the back of your head for other things that we just need to start applying that to the media and the news and the, memes that we imbibe on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I think media literacy is a practice. So I will always espouse that. Like, you don't just become media literate.
Right.
You are always learning how to interact with media as media changes and evolves. And so to your point, like we know to be good, do price comparison shopping when we're shopping, or to question things when, we're trying to buy a new car. They're trying to tell us it costs this much because they're adding this package to it. Like, we have all kinds of, with those sorts of things. But I also think it's also applying appropriately, because some of the messaging that people have received, and again, this is all kind of in the name of like preventative, but maybe gone a bit too far, which is believe nothing.
Right.
When we talk to people now in research, no one wants to admit that they accept any one source as truth, even if they are doing it, because it makes them feel like they're not, like they would come across as foolish.
Sure.
So I have to say, well, actually, if you see a story from the Associated Press, it says this happened today, like, you probably don't need to corroborate that with the second source. Like, you can just be good, right? So don't misapply your skepticism on things that don't deserve it,
Sure.
So we always have to just keep learning, because, now I have to apply the media literacy to the Chat GPT. Got to figure that one out for myself and for my students.
Well, and that brings me to maybe, like I said, the last question, forecasting ahead is it AI that you think is going to be the greatest challenge for disinformation going forward? Is it something else? Like, what are you and your colleagues thinking about in the next, 5-10 years that we need to really be worried about, whether that's around elections or just generally? I'm just curious what your thinking is.
So, I mean, I think we need to be worried about all of those things that you just said. But I'm going to just like take it a step back, and maybe this is kind of a non-answer, but I think we need to be worried about how unprepared we are to consume media, just sort of point blank. And because things aren't going to stop changing,
right?
Because we don't know how to do it. Obviously, we've seen that's not going to happen. That ChatGPT got a wide commercial release, or a wide public release, before it had been like really tested.
Right.
And before we even really know what it can and can't do, just proves that the technology is going to continue to advance, and it's going to be able to do a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. And we can recognize that. I think we do recognize that as a threat, but we just still don't stop to say, well, what do we need to do as people? And also, what do we need to do as institutions, right? Like, government is looking out to others. Government is looking out to what do the tech companies need to do? What do the educators need to do? What do the people need to do? Well, what does government need to do, right? Like, we need to be looking inward individually in the institutions we represent. How do we make sense of this for ourselves, right? I can't teach a student about AI until I can better understand it.
Yeah.
So again, that was a non-answer. All of this is concerning because the people who are going to use this for sort of perverse gain don't have to care. They don't have to understand how it works. They just have to know how to use it. And we know they already have really great tactics for manipulating people. So great. Now they just have a better tool to do that. That's faster and cheaper and removes humans from the equation on the production side, right? So obviously that's terrifying. But also, like, we just fundamentally need some skills, tools, and tactics that I think we can apply to technology as it advances if we stop for a minute and like give ourselves that baseline. And certainly that's oversimplifying things, because I don't think we educate our way out of this necessarily. It's more of like, that's part of it, and just recognizing we do have some say over this. I don't know. That was a really wide, rambling question.
It's good. And I think your point about, to rephrase sort of what you were just saying, AI and these new technologies are coming. Like, they're here and they're getting, better and faster and newer and every single day. So like, it's a fact of life. We have to accept it and figure out how to deal with them.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we really are not prepared for is, because nobody was prepared for ChatGPT to arrive, right? It's like a totally new thing. People were shocked by it and what it could do. But other companies see this, and now they're developing similar things. And I feel like every day there's a new post about a new AI thing, whether that's for photos or videos, for words, for coding, anything. And that's where I think it's really going to be scary is, the 3, 4, 5 companies down the line that really don't care about any kind of oversight, that really don't care to do the double and triple checking and everything else and make sure that things are working right. How are we going to deal with that? Because it's coming, it's just that we haven't seen it yet.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, sort of capitalist impulses to make money off of new technologies is what sort of breaks us all in this, because we cannot fight those forces, certainly not with education. Do you know what I mean?
For sure.
And so you're right. Like, for every one company that's going to do their best, there will be lots of imitators that won't, and that won't matter to the consumer, right?
Right.
Yeah, but like, on the bright side, let's end on a positive note. These technologies also represent opportunity. I actually don't have that much of a positive note. I just think that, like, we can also, like, part of this sort of advanced awareness of what's happening is to figure out how we can use these technologies for good.
Yep.
And that's all part of the process, part of the educating process. So I try to remain healthfully optimistic or skeptical, what am I trying to say? Like, lightly optimistic, or at least not so gloom and doom.
Sure.
That we can strike a balance. But like, right now, it's tough.
Yeah. Well, it's a good way to end it. Right now, it's tough.
That's right. That's all I have to say.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. And thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more updates about disinformation and updates from our task force, and see you again soon. Thank you so much.